Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
It is. It's showtime. Here we go. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And as we record this session and we gather the crew around the table, it is just after 3 o'clock on January the 28th. We are 50 minutes away from the legislature at Queen's Park officially dissolving. The premier met with the lieutenant governor. As far as I know, he's still in there. They ran out of space. He's been in there talking a long time. It's not clear if and when he's going to meet with the media. Doesn't really matter. There's plenty to say. So let's get around to the group around the table. Laura Babcock is here. Of course, she is from Power Group Communications, host of the wildly popular O Show. Gerard Kennedy is also with us today. He is former MPP for High Parkdale, the former Minister of Education, former federal MP, so bring some interesting perspective there. And of course, John Wright is our founding pollster here at On the Ledge. Just quick around the table. The first argument, Laura, is that this is an unnecessary election, that in fact Ford already has a strong mandate. All I hear from the Tories is that, yeah, well, that criticism will just fade into the background and he will march smartly onto a new majority.
I don't think so. I don't think it'll fade. And I did an op-ed in the Toronto Star about this the other day. You know, he's leveraging the Captain Canada moment, the moment when Canadians are most concerned. And he's done a fairly good job as the head of the Federation of the Premiers dealing with Ford or with Trump and the tariffs. My concern, though, and I said it in the Star, is that you've got all of this goodwill and you're deciding that rather than just focus on stabilizing the country as we face the threats from Trump on February 1st, and you have this opportunity as Captain Canada to really get some solidarity when we've got a couple of other premiers who are, you know, threatening a unity crisis, I'd rather Ford focus there. But instead, what he's doing is he's saying, hey, this is an opportunity when Ontarians are scared, when everything is in flux, when, you know, people are feeling unstable, to grab another majority mandate when he's got, 14 months left. So it looks as though it's opportunistic. It's going to cost us a ton of money. And this from a premier who's just coming away from another report saying he way overspent on the unnecessary cancellation of the beer store contract, that his whole task force or his whole initiatives around cutting red tape profited developers, and he's wasted. And we know this. We have a record of his waste, right? So we don't need him wasting more of our money on this unnecessary election just for some sort of advantage to him and the PC party. I don't think people are going to forget about that. I think we liked him when he looked like he was fighting for Canada and talking tough. We don't like the fact that now we've got to spend a month going through his record of, I think, a lot of policy failures and scandals. This is the last thing Ontarians need. They might get another majority, but I think there will be a price to pay. And there's a possibility of reducing the seats, even possibly to a minority.
So, Gerard, is this at a stage where you're glad that you're not in that business anymore?
You know what? It's I have a contrarian kind of nature, so it's almost bad enough in the political land it's the first time I ever got an itch in the last 10 years. I think there's a lot of loss of faith on people's part, and I think that Laura's right that the goodwill that Mr. Ford's been building up could be gone if this really is cemented as mainly for Ford. If this is mainly an election for Mr. Ford to be able to carry on his advantages, and not to grab anybody else's slogans, but whether it's for him, for his friends, it doesn't feel like it's for Ontario. It doesn't feel like something's going to get resolved here that's going to matter to average people. And, that's a little bit against brand for Premier Ford. I think he's been fortunate in that regard, that he's been able to come up on the right side of issues, some of them that he started and then decided not to finish and so on. And the good guy image could go away because that is a lot of money to waste. And it's kind of hard to say what kind of mandate is he going to get to, what is he going to get that he couldn't have had before the election. So I think that the little guy or whoever it is that he styles himself being on the side of is going to ask questions. With any luck for him, they'll kind of fall asleep and maybe not see the election as being about very much. But I do think that you don't want to poke the bear. Right now, there are people out there, and I think they want to know who's responsible for this unease they feel. And all across the world, post-COVID elections haven't gone that well for incumbents. And even though Mr. Ford has kind of been there in the, I don't know what you want to call it, but I guess in the trail of the federal government taking on most of the blame, there might be some left for him.
So, John, speak to that in terms of the brand, because you always want to bring it back to the front porch, the kitchen table. So where does all of this land for you initially on day one?
Well, I tend to be a bit of a contrarian when it comes to this, to our other two friends here. I think it's a good time for him to go, and I think there's a few reasons for it. Number one, it sort of sandwiches itself in between the changeover that may happen at a federal election. And as a result, he's got fresh conservative workers who might be working on both campaigns, and so he can put them to use now. So number one, tactically, it makes a good decision with respect to resources. And number two, he has an issue he can go on. Whether or not it's going to be a justifiable one, we'll see over the next 2 weeks. But we have to remember that Mr. Trump's threat is that February the 1st is the day that we may get some knowledge of what the tariffs would look like. And as a result, it'll come in the early part of this campaign, and it may, in fact, focus on that issue. Number three, he starts out really strong. I mean, he's at 42% on average, 42% in the polls versus 26 for the Liberals, 21 for the NDP, and 7 for the Greens. You only need 37% for a majority government, and he's got also 47%, almost half the public saying that he's got a favorable view. So you've got that deck of cards, which deal you some pretty strong numbers going out of the gate. The last 2 points to make. Number one is the issues. While the tariff issue only ranks as number 5 out of 5% for those in Ontarians, healthcare and the economy do rank at the top of that list. And in fact, you know, the others will try and deal with it. But the Ford press conferences over the last 24 hours have at least tried to put some blunt on that. But the other thing is to look at the opposition leaders. I mean, I got to tell you, I mean, protecting Ontario is a good slogan for the Tories. You know, more for you from the Liberals. I don't know what the NDP is going to be, but more for you just plays into that Tory handbag of saying, yeah, more carbon tax, more taxes, more bureaucracy, more red tape, more blah, blah, blah. So I think it catches the Liberals who are not as well fundraised and not ready to have all their candidates ready to go, and the NDP a little bit off guard. So coming out of the gate, I give pretty much an 8 out of 10 to the Ford camp, a 5 out of 10 to the others. And we'll see what happens after the first 2 weeks.
Well, Laura, we all saw this coming. I mean, Doug Ford started talking about an early election possibility back in the summer and so everything. So what strikes me about what John just left off with is what appears to be the unpreparedness of both the Liberals and the NDP.
Yeah, it's been brutal. And to John's point, absolutely, Ford can probably win this thing. He's got all the advantage. If I were a cynical tactician, I'd be saying, yeah, go now while there's instability and people don't really know where their head's at and who to blame. So yeah, tactically, this is good for Ford. But is it good for Ontario is the question. And I don't think that it is, for a host of reasons I'm happy to get into, not the least of which is his slogan. I'll disagree with my friend John here. Protect Ontario. Yes, it plays into the fear of Trump, and fear is a good motivator, and people are very easily subjectable or influenced when they're fearful. But you know what? He has made Ontario vulnerable by having 2 million Ontarians without a doctor, right? He has made Ontario more vulnerable by spending billions of our dollars on stupid secret deals, projects that we don't even want, a $50 to $100 billion tunnel under the 401. I haven't heard a single person who thinks that makes any sense. And he's mired in scandal and has an RCMP investigation. Ontario voters haven't even gotten to go to the ballot box yet on the Greenbelt scandal. So, I mean, he's got a lot of negatives, and I think having us go through them for the next month when we're already upset and agitated, yes, it looks like a good way for the Ford government to just slam themselves into another 4 years. But every single person that I've talked to who's a business person is like, I don't appreciate the timing. I think that this is too self-serving, and that gets them upset. And we've seen a premier in Ontario get kicked to the curb when I moved here in 1990 because of that very selfish election timing. And we've also got people now looking at all of his record. He hasn't had to fight on the Greenbelt yet. So I think he's more vulnerable than John suggests, but the slogan, protect us, when he has been the one to make us vulnerable, And his not funding ODSP properly, guys, shutting down rent controls. He has made the homeless crisis much worse. 81,000 people. We've got how many thousands of families with autism that aren't being served? So he has made, from my worldview, working with vulnerable populations in Ontario, he's made us more vulnerable as a province. And I liken it to, and this analogy might be controversial, but it's like when you're with an abusive partner and they're saying, you need me to keep protecting you. And you're like, yeah, but you made me vulnerable. Like, I don't like that language. I don't think the positioning works. And when he said the other day, we better pray that he gets a majority, that kind of intimidating tone, I think is going to backfire. So timing is bad. Tone is bad. Yes, they'll probably win, but are they going to be reduced to a minority? And it won't be because the opposition's ready. Dave, to your question, Bonnie has been slow out of the gate. Merritt, I don't feel is ready for prime time. And unfortunately, I've interviewed her. She's great, but I don't think she's ready for Ford. So what'll happen if Ontarians decide strategically who in my riding can beat the Ford candidate, who can take a seat from Ford, and they vote that way? There might be a minority for Ford because of the reasons that I cited.
Is Laura being rather optimistic or overly hopeful here, Gerard?
Well, I think there's a lot to what Laura is saying, but there's also to what John is saying as well. I mean, the political calculus is somewhat transparent. It's a little too political, I think. I think that's what might come marching back at Mr. Ford. I think the public out there, like having been on the business end of the voting, you should never underestimate him. And Peterson was trying to perhaps paper over a recession that they knew was underway, and from my vantage point in the food bank, that was pretty messy at the time. A lot of people, I think, felt disappointed. With Mr. Ford, there could be a certain other breach of trust that takes place. It's not because things are super wobbly on the economy front. In fact, it's probably building back, and I think that's part of the equation. But I think people do want to know why. Why is there no stamina on the part of Mr. Ford to stay in there and do the job? Why does he need to go early? And I think the opposition, if they do get their act together, that's probably where they're going to go, which is not so much the money only. There's a whole long list of things that are kind of special interest monies that could have been used for primary care, could have been used for education. I mean, you do have food bank use up 400%. The assistance from the government is actually down 6%. There are 6% fewer people able to get help. There's a bunch of things that have been privatized, and I'm not sure that everybody has that list. I just think this is the time when people are going to look for a bit of a reckoning. And if the opposition, to John's point, not really organized, back on their heels, but if they're able to land some of those things and attach them to Mr. Ford, I would say that there's probably more risk out there for Mr. Ford than he and his advisors think.
John, let's just go back, because historically we want to keep pointing back to Peterson, and I understand why, because it was so much fun in the press gallery that day when they got the election. Somebody chained themselves to the table, and it was rather hilarious. But this is not the same thing. This, I mean, having a huge lead in the polls and calling an early election for seemingly no reason. I understand the comparison, but again, I'm not sure we can equally compare the Peterson situation to what Ford's doing right now.
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, every time I hear Laura talk, I always think of a leader standing at the front with a group of people behind her, banging the desk saying, here are some honorable members. It's wonderful to hear. But I would say that, you're right, David, is the very first, this is now, I think, my 20th election campaign that I've covered. My very first was that election campaign. My very first public opinion poll that was released with the media was that campaign, and it came very late in the campaign, a week to go, where within less than the margin of error, it showed that Bob Rae was going to win. It started out with 50% showing support at the beginning of the campaign in July, and there wasn't really anything else until that poll came out. So let's remember, I think Gerard's absolutely right. There was the tastes of a massive recession that was on the way that basically gobbled up Bob Rae while he was there. But the background then was a little bit different. We were coming off of Meech Lake, which was very, very controversial. It was also Peterson. People forget this. During the course of that, and in order to appease Quebec, had given away 2 Senate seats, and that really rankled a lot of people. It doesn't get a lot of coverage, but I remember it from the time. And thirdly, it was tactically motivated. It was early because Bob Rae had hinted that he wasn't going to run in the next election campaign. Rae and the NDP were not very popular, and so Peterson pulled the trigger somewhat tactically to move forward. I remember the day when the earth changed and Bob Nixon was at the Ottawa Exposition, and out of somewhat desperation, I guess, from the polls that they were seeing, and we hadn't taken ours yet, they dropped the sales tax, and it seems so contrary to the campaign. So when you wrap all of that up, you say, well, it's different then, but it is the same. Early going, something happened during the campaign where the public decided to shift because they heard something or thought of something. And campaigns matter, how you run them. And this is going to come down to that. The only thing that I think, again, is in the Premier's favor is it, if you want to make it the ballot question that we are to fight Trump's tariffs, then his first stop will be the Windsor Bridge with those flags flying in the background. He'll stake his vote on that. He'll move then on to London, Ontario, where he'll meet with the manufacturers and say, this is all about that. And then he'll go out to the province. But he's clearly marking his territory as when these tariffs come in a few days or a week from now, he's prepared for that ballot question. And I don't know how hard the others are going to be able to fight that.
Well, the ballot question is an important one. And I think it's funny that, again, the issue of the tariffs is out there, and it's obviously an existential issue for us, economically at least, Gerard. But when we talk about, John pointed out earlier, we're saying that the number one issues based on polling were the cost of living and healthcare, 1, 2. But I thought it was interesting, the most recent Leger polling had it broken down by party. And if you look at affordability among PC voters, it was 32%. Among NDP, 31%. But among the Liberals, it's only 19%. So I don't know if that means there's a tone deafness there, or they're going to have a hard time kind of gaining any traction on what seems to be the kitchen table conversation.
Yeah, it's hard to, you said earlier, at least, John said earlier about healthcare and education. I think that every provincial election is going to be somewhat about how people feel about those things. And with the lineups that are still out there for emergency rooms, that was a phenomenal bad visual of people lined up for the new family. I think it was a single new family doctor in a rural Ontario community. I think, and that is, I think those are that to me, that's more bread and butter. I think that there's been an easing on the inflation. I think the Trudeau government and Mr. Trudeau himself took the hit for the inflation, which, there's economic arguments back and forth about how much should have been done during the pandemic, but that precipitated some of that. But, I do think that that's still what's going to tell the tale here. Do people feel okay about what's going on? There's a lot of roiling going on in both healthcare and in education. A lot of kids got passed through because they were learning at home and certain tests didn't apply and other things didn't happen. But we got unqualified people in front of the classroom. There are certainly not a feeling of confidence on the part of the teachers and the parents that are out there. I get it. I mean, it's hard to say. If you don't tap into it, it's like anything else. It can just stay there as an undercurrent. But my sense is that there's something more to that. And it's Mr. Ford is taking that risk. You're going to come and talk to people about how well he's doing. He wants to talk about a federal issue that's worked for parties sometimes, talk about something that's mainly in the other realm, and the fact that Mr. Trudeau is lame duck now and that there is perhaps a sense of a vacuum there. He might be able to get away with that, but I don't hear him saying anything too convincing on his weaknesses. And then there's a third weakness, I think, which is the things that he's paid for that other people are benefiting from. And, I'm not saying that RCMP is going to come forward with their investigation, but you've got not just the tunnel or the spa or a whole bunch of disconnected things there. The opposition is going to have to put that together into some kind of theme that people can relate to. But it's a pretty long list. It's pretty expensive. People can understand if what is it, $1.7 billion price tag for beer at the street corner. That doesn't look like somebody looking after them. And Galen Weston is probably okay without having had that little gift. So, there's a way, I think, that this becomes more interesting than it appears right now. The parties in opposition have to do a lot of that work. people in some of your tradecraft in journalism have got to do some of the other, not against Mr. Ford, but just to make sure that this election is about something he wishes it isn't about very much, that it's really just about a likable guy who's surprised you favorably each time he's been caught at something you didn't like, seems to be aligned with getting along with, you know, the thrust of standing up for Canada. Will that stand up against, you know, some tangibles out there in healthcare, education, and really not looking after the public interest very strongly? I'd be curious to see, because I think before we started this conversation, somebody asked, well, do you miss, or maybe it was at the beginning of this, you know, what I miss is that we're not building better government or better politics, and we're not a big enough country that that's optional. And when Trump goes putting things on the table, like saying we want to make you a state or probably just a territory, because that's how much we think of you guys, it's time for people to stand up for a better brand of politics. This election is gotta be, it's a ranking thing, whether it goes back to 90 or wherever it ends up. It's a highly cynical thing. It says to you, the average voter, you don't matter very much. I got your number. I know what you're gonna do 30 days from now. Let's walk on through this exercise. Let's have a little sing along. Let cash your $200 check, be distracted. You know, if you don't think, you don't like what I'm doing, don't even show up. You know, don't even show up at the vote, just like last time. Not a bunch of people didn't show up. Down the states, Mr. Trump got elected by the people who didn't show up to the last election. That's pretty much who elected Mr. Trump. So he's depending on that. I'm really hoping that we're going to have a little bit of life left in the Canadian body politic here. And, you know, I can't read John's expressions there. It looks like he might be saying no to that, but.
Well, I think campaigns really matter. And I would say that if you stripped away the rhetoric and the tone of Mr. Trump and you looked at both of the parties, you would have seen an agenda, which in fact Democrats, to a degree, but not totally, of course, would have agreed with, that the economy was the #1 issue, that illegal immigration was certainly top of the list. When you went, you know, the role of government, when you went down that list, that was Trump's campaign pitch without the rhetoric. You know, on the other side, it was, don't hire that guy because it'll be bad for democracy and he's a convicted felon. I mean, that was actually the other side of the Democrat campaign. So I think you have to have something. And secondly, you know, I really, you know, you talk about the RCMP coming in. The last time the RCMP came in on anything, I think, was Ralph Goodell during an election campaign. I don't think they're going to bring in anything during this one. Look, I really do believe that we need to not just focus on Mr. Ford, but to understand what his opposition is about. And I haven't seen that in action yet. In many ways, 28% of Ontarians for both Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie have a favorable view, but the rest of them really either don't or don't know them. Most of them don't, despite the fact that there's been a whole lot of negative advertising placed against Bonnie Crombie. I'm interested to see how she performs. I think she's had a rough time of it when you go from, you know, the mayor of Mississauga, and you kind of command everything you do in that area and all of the attention, to being a provincial leader and having to shake hands at some hamburger place in downtown Peterborough. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because I've been there. But, you know, though that it's a long way from downtown Mississauga, this will be the first chance to see the Liberal machine in Ontario, you know, put some gas in the tank and come to order. We've also got third-party advertising for both sides of the Conservatives and the opposition. It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. But in order to get a majority, you only need 37% of the vote. Only 37. In order to have a minority, it's only 34% of the vote. Do we actually think that Doug Ford's going to fall below 34%? I don't think going into this campaign I'd even go near that. So, you know, at the outset, I think he's in a pretty good position to win power again. But I'm going to be very interested to see the campaigns that the other two roll out. That's the only thing that I'd like to see them within the next week. And I think that'll really tell the tale.
Well, Laura, does it surprise you, though, that when we start to break down those issues, and understandably, affordability, the cost of living has been top of mind for months and months, if not the last few years, particularly through the pandemic and so on. But it just seems to me that's a striking number, that only 19% of the Liberal voters think that that's the big issue. Now, it's their #1 issue, but only 19% as opposed to something up with, a third of the others. Now maybe it's a one-off and it's a poll, but it just seems striking to me that there's a disconnect there.
Listen, people are busy. It's 2025, not 2020 or 1990. And so you have to crack through with a strong message, right? And so the slogans of the Liberals and the NDP aren't going to do it. What it is about is that you've got Ford wanting this to be an anti-Trump election. That's his whole raison d'etre for that. That's his whole, his whole rationale is we got to fight Trump. I think he's at high risk of the narrative being we've got to fight Ford. This becoming an anti-Ford election. Ford has not experienced an anti-Ford election. If you recall, the first time out of the gate, it was an anti-Kathleen Wynne, and she had a terrible campaign with Sorry Not Sorry, right? It was awful. I've had her on the O Show a bunch of times. She's a smart woman, but that was a bad campaign. And so it was not anti-Ford. He was the outsider coming in. And then the next time around, people were so happy to be able to get out of their lockdowns, right? That they didn't really care to even show up at the polls. And he was running against Andrea Horwath, who basically just spent all her time attacking Del Duca, who was a terrible candidate. So you had the opposition last time turn their guns on each other, and Ford got away with 18%. So here's the thing, is Ford wants to make this all anti-Trump. It's against Trump. Got to protect Ontario against Trump. I'm Captain Canada. Look at me at the bridge. Look at me at the border. Look at me wherever. There's also a huge pent-up amount of people in this province who just might be activated in an anti-Ford message, which is to say, have you been to a hospital in this province or tried to get to a doctor in the last 6 years that Ford's been in charge with the majority? How's your city doing? Because he's in charge of municipalities. Not great, huh? How's housing? Well, he missed all of his own housing targets. And what about that promise he made at Ford Fest that we'd all have $100,000 homes or whatever with picket fences? That never came to fruition. He broke promises, didn't meet his own agenda items, and he's mired in scandal. And so whether or not the RCMP comes out or not, that's not going to make a difference. What's going to make a difference is if people in Ontario say, wait a second, didn't meet the housing targets, increased homelessness, hospital care sucks, they're paying 3 times more than they need to private nursing agencies. Who wanted that? I only have so much money in my pocket, and I'm sick and tired of seeing it wasted on a tunnel under the 401 or a secret spa deal with an Austrian company or shutting down small businesses in Ontario and laying off Canadians for a U.S. hedge fund with Staples deal. I mean, people are looking at that and going, he's not meeting what he said he would do. I don't trust him after the Greenbelt, and he's wasting my hard-earned cash. So no more of this guy. No more supermajority for this guy. When you break trust, you break trust. And this is the first election where Ontarians, the ballot question is not going to be Trump. It's going, because that's our federal conversation. It's going to be anti-Ford. And so I don't think he's ready for that. He's taking a risk. He'll probably win. He's a smart guy. He's good at politics. We've seen that. But this is the first time that if people get engaged, and that's the ticket, of course, and vote strategically, he has a chance to not get the supermajority he's demanding that we better pray we give him. It might actually turn out to be no, actually. It's our first chance as a province. We're not in a COVID hangover. We've seen your record. We've seen your failures. We hate driving to the store because of all of our homeless neighbors. And all you're doing is crapping on them, saying that they're lazy, taking away safe injection sites to help them with recovery. You are actually making people more vulnerable. And you're telling us that you're the guy to protect us against Trump. How about you do the job as premier? How about you not take more money for this cynical election? I think there are winds of anti-Ford that have yet to be expressed at the ballot box.
Well, and to some degree,
I wish that Laura Babcock would actually have an opinion on the Tories and Ford in this.
Then I could have a show called the O Show for the opinion show, John.
I know. We're going to rename it the Oh Wow Show here.
But let me just go back to the ballot question, and I think that's an important part of this conversation because each one of them is going to want to dictate the ballot question, and whoever comes out on top is likely to be making gains at the end of the day. Trump, John, may not have anything to do necessarily with the provincial politics of the day, and certainly is good cover for the record of the premier and his government right now. But at the same time, we've got, I heard, Mayor Stiles talking about taking all the tolls off the 407 and making it available to everybody. And all I heard was everybody crapping all over her, saying that's not the brand for the NDP. Well, if we're not going to get into a situation where we start talking about big issues, then we're back to the distractions like the Trump tariffs and so on.
Well, I'm not sure the Trump tariffs is a distraction. I think it's way more than that.
Well, I mean, I think it's bigger than having to actually have him respond to his record.
Yeah. And people are very worried about that. Either in an urban or rural case, they really are. So, let's step back from it again. Dave, I really think slogans and campaigns matter. And I don't know what the NDP has that'll frame their campaign. I'm not running the Liberal campaign, so I don't doubt their sincerity. But, if you'd had a campaign which might say, build better. I remember before Bill Davis went in 1980, I was a parliamentary intern back then at Queen's Park. And they create Huey Siegel and Ed Stewart created this thing called the Board of Industrial Leadership and Development. And it was all about putting jobs and businesses out there for investment. But if you actually looked at the acronym of it, it was Bill Davis, BILD. There's some ambiguity and smarts that go on here. And so protecting Ontario being the conservative side is not just about their ability to talk about protect us from Trump, but it's also protect Ontario with what we've developed and what we've done for it. And I know, Laura, you're going to jump all over that with all kinds of things that he hasn't done. But again, it's a platform for that. All the Liberals have are 9 seats. The question is whether they can carve out some that are low-hanging fruit from the NDP with the campaign, the lack of funds that they have, but they've then put on the plate more for you. Okay, more doctors, more social assistants, more, all that sort of stuff. The opposition, Doug Ford's people are just going to look at it and go, what? More taxes. Remember what he did? Again, campaigning really matters. We're in a short period of time. And I think people are there's about half of them already who've made up their mind who they're going to support. But just as the debate gets underway, whenever we have one, the week before that, the other half will generally start to make up their minds. And in the home stretch, it'll be another 10 to 15% who will have to make up their minds at the ballot box. But it sure doesn't give enough time for most parties to define exactly the ballot question they are offering. At least the one the Conservatives have is very, very clear.
I would listen. I think because John invoked me. Do you mind if I just respond?
Please do.
So I would agree that the Bonnie campaign has been lackluster, and the NDP I think are in a lose position here, in spite of their good intentions, right? But this is where I think Ford is more vulnerable, and I'll be fascinated to see how this plays out. Is that when you had Del Duca, I always get it wrong, on the stage with Andrea Horwath, he was not a good pick, right? And the Liberals had a very damaged brand at that moment. I feel as though there was pent up desire to vote for somebody other than Ford, because at least as a business person, you've got the gig for 6 years, right? With little supervision, tons of power and authority to do what you want. And you still couldn't meet your housing targets, which goes to an affordability kitchen. There's no more kitchen table issue than not having a roof over your head. So they didn't meet their affordable housing targets or housing targets. They have been mired and slowed down in all these anti-transparency trust questions, right? People don't trust them. And once you lose trust, as we all know, it's very hard to gain it back. So people just don't trust everything he's going to say anymore. And people are looking at his own record. He didn't make his own targets, but he had all the power and control to do it. So that
might not be enough. Sorry, John.
Yeah, I just want to throw back to you again. In the traditional Tories universe, it's kind of the rural vote that would go with them. And you would, hone in on that urban vote that you're talking about for some of those things. I also come from a city, though, in downtown Toronto, in St. Paul's, which traditionally been liberal over and over again. Hey, I'm facing a 26% tax hike as a resident of the city of Toronto because I own a home in the last 3 years. and I'll be damned if I'm going to let anybody else put another inch of tax on top of me. I mean, in many ways, look, I don't disagree with you, Laura, that there's a constituency out there that's going to go hard at the premier, that there are winds of change, and that Bonnie Crombie will all wait for the deciding moment how she's going to do. But some of the traditional, things that the center left would be looking for in this, maybe overshadowed by somebody who says, I'm going to protect your homes from more taxes. I'm going to protect it from waste and inefficiency. Let's take a look and see what the Liberal leader did, and let's see what the NDP leader would probably do, because there's an NDP coalition in downtown Toronto. So I'm not so sure at the moment that some of those arguments that have been put forward, logically the ones you put, are necessarily going to have the same tuning fork in the places they normally would.
I don't think they're rural urban.
Well,
I don't. Just sorry, one last thing, Gerard, and then I'll shut up.
Yeah, we'll yield the floor.
They're not rural urban, right? The hospitals that have been closing, the ERs have been rural ERs that have been closing.
That big lineup was in Walkerton, I think.
Right. And the Walkerton line was Walkerton. The homeless issue, I have heard, as you know, I work with a homeless line in an urban core, but I've heard from people in small towns across Ontario saying, Laura, this is not just an urban issue. So I think that idea that some of these more center left issues are just urban elites and their fussy little issues, I don't think so. I think that healthcare has become a small town problem under Doug Ford. And I think that seeing Sylvia Jones out there today promising, the moon and the stars when she had 7 years to help the people and hasn't, I don't, when the trust is eroded, all the promises they're going to dump on us the next 15 days, people are going to look at and say, well, why didn't you do it 2 years ago when we begged for it? So I'm just not sure that the calculus.
Well, I see you're making a connection, Laura, though. I think that if I could do my old Liberal thing and come up the middle, it's up to the opposition to prove a case. And I think that what you know and what you feel isn't yet what everybody else there feels. But I think if the Liberals are able to say it really is going to be about you, and the only thing he's protecting is himself. Look what Mr. Ford has done. $300 million for an election because he doesn't want to face you at a less opportune time. Right. $1.7 billion because he wanted to rush some kind of foolish campaign promise in. We don't know what the cost of the tunnel is going to be. He got, he paid $1 billion for teachers because he treated them a certain way. And your local school hasn't recovered from the pandemic. Every teacher is telling you that, but so are parents with kids and grandparents and so on. And you don't have the confidence that you want to have in healthcare. You just had that confidence rattled because we went through a pandemic and looked like it was a touch and go for a lot of people. And sadly, for a lot of elderly in our long-term care homes, they didn't do so well. And the only track record so far that Mr. Ford has to point to is outsourcing surgeries and other things. So it will, to John's point, depend on the opposition to bring this together, to make it accessible and available. And Laura, I mean, I think it's easy to do a critique if you're really well sort of tuned in here in terms of Mr. Ford over and over again looking for a mulligan. And he hopes he'll get a mulligan just by talking about something way off, not off on the horizon, but the threat on the horizon that isn't really his business. It's somebody else's to look after. He should be a constructive part of it. So I think that's a dynamic to be interested to assert itself. And I'll come back to something I've already said. What really will make a difference here is an alert public. And I think they're alert. I think the things that you've seen in elections elsewhere means there is some comeback. I think the Democrats down south were arrogant. I think they let go of a bunch of people in the issues, and they tried to play what has been a Republican game of splicing off votes and so on. And they left the big field open to Mr. Trump in terms of what are people grumpy about? What do people need to feel? And he gave them what people needed to feel. And so here, yes, John, I can't say that. I mean, you look at the commercial that the Liberals put enough scratch together to put out about Ms. Crombie, about a long sort of family history of bootstrapping themselves and immigrants and so on, putting a human face on her. The fact is that, and another thing I put a price tag on is all those government commercials that are not supposed to be played 6 months ahead of an election. Well, look who found a loophole there. So if the opposition is able to show Mr. Ford is someone who doesn't respect average people, who is using their money poorly, who is floating economically, partly because of all the bailouts he had from the federal government, and he hasn't made those stick together very well. If that comes together, that's not a very pretty picture.
And
now, the question is, will it? And will it come together in time? I would say, John, day one of the election announcement probably goes to Mr. Ford, and probably days 1 through 10. That's what's going to take the opposition to get fully going. We'll see what they come up with. But I do trust the people. I don't think you can just be that cynical and just run it the way you think. It all looks good in the internal war rooms, but people are a little more on edge because of
timing is the issue here, though, right? Yeah. Timing is the issue here. I mean, we've talked about the tactic and the strategy around this has all been hanging on timing. The timing of the federal chaos that's going on with the Liberal Party, the federal chaos that's going on with Washington and Ottawa. This is all timing politically and tactically. So, John, when we look at this, a lot of that vote's been baked in already in terms of, where people are leaning already. And we haven't seen a whole lot of huge shift in that. So Laura's going to have to speak more passionately than she already is if she's going to see any kind of shift. Like, it's going to be hard to move any of that. Yeah, the Liberals and the NDP are at each other's throat for the same vote, pretty much. Timing is an issue.
Yeah, but I remember different election campaigns having outcomes that people didn't expect. I remember one of Stephen Harper's campaigns, we were going into the weekend where he looked like it was going to have a full majority. And we woke up on, he actually said on the bus, I'm going to have a majority, and all of a sudden backlash across the country. And he ended up with a minority. The campaigns matter. And this is going to be the most important campaign for the Liberals, not the NDP, the Liberals, in a long time. Can they get 12, 15 seats? Is Bonnie Crombie a worthy jouster? I mean, can she get in there and parry with Doug Ford despite all the negative advertising? Is there some vulnerability once we get into the debate over tariffs that she and Merritt Stiles may take advantage of? Maybe it's going to be, don't give him the keys to the car to negotiate everything. Put us at the table. I mean, he's not going to be there for you on X, Y, and Z. Put us there. I don't know what their argument's going to be. But, in many ways, I think we'd all have to agree that for Merritt Stiles and Bonnie Crombie, this is their moment. Even though it may be stacked against them, they both are going to have to come at him in a really serious way. Bonnie, there was some endorsement for Merritt Stiles, of course, from the steelworkers, but Doug Ford's also got some endorsements from the unions. Going out of the gate, it looks like it's going to be in his favor. Yeah. But I'll be like every other pollster and say I hedge my bets on the campaigns matter, the dynamics matter. And I want to come back to this. I don't know how the opposition is going to run their campaigns. That, for me, will be the most interesting thing to watch.
Well, let me
just throw in an anecdote if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly, is 1990. I'm at a friend's wedding. I think it was Toronto Island, and I'm in the men's washroom, and not right next to me is Bob Ray telling me how he's getting out of politics. Right?
Yes.
And then,
yep.
So, but then the election's called, right? I mean, and so, I think that was not a prepared opposition. Like when you say the things that you're saying, John, and I think about them from my election experiences, the difference between our 99 election and our 2003 one is we were ready for 2003. We made bloody sure that we were running at least a part of what mattered then, and it turned out to be a great deal of it. And we were able to earn that election. 99, we were all over the place. But I think opportunity is there. I still want to come back to something that, I guess I'd be interested in your in-depth thought about what has happened in so many jurisdictions where there seems to be something bad happened to the electorate, and they kind of want to change. There's a deep sort of search thing there. It may not be identified yet on the top line stuff, but it's there. I can feel it out there. A lot of conversations I have with people, that's real. I think we're underestimating at our peril. Is Bonnie Crombie or is Merritt Stiles ever able to put their thumb on that and to channel that in the next number of days? I think it's there to be had. I don't think that's what Mr. Ford is doing. I think he wants to be talking about the next thing, not what he's done, and not what and therefore what options could be.
So if I can, like, Ford has them in a hard place, right? He's got them on a very short timeline. You got reading week in there. I've got people reaching out to the O show going, I'm going on holiday to Florida or wherever. How am I supposed to vote? The timing is incredibly both cynical and politically opportunistic and probably brilliant, right? Here's the thing. Bonnie has let him define her for months and months and months as being expensive, right? Which is hilarious when you look at Ford's cottage up in Muskokas, right? So this whole house in the Hamptons versus his own cottage. She waited way too long to get in the fight. She let her opposition define her, which is a huge mistake. And I think what Bonnie is counting on, and the Liberals are counting on, is this anti-Ford sentiment that I talked about, where people don't want to give him the keys to the car again, but they don't know where to place the vote. And if I hear one more time that Ontario will never vote NDP after the Bob Rae thing, and Merritt was on my show trying to explain why that was no longer, really a factor. I think it still is with older voters. So, I mean, people are looking for a place to park their frustration with Ford. And if Bonnie can do a campaign where she doesn't screw it up and is out there looking like she can fight and it's a stable government and she's got a decent team, I think she's going to collect some of those votes. And I think that if other people, I'm hearing from a lot of NDPers who are like, you know what? Want to vote NDP, always have, but I really can't take any more Ford. Not the scandals, not the failures on these key health and education and housing priorities, right? So he's got a bad record. He's got a ton of scandal. And if I can quote Tim Hudak, who's on a panel with me, I don't want to steal his line, but he said that anytime Ford looks like he's not fighting for the little guy is kryptonite, right? So if the opposition parties are able to not turn guns on each other like Horvath and Del Duca and actually just point them both at Ford and say, you are not for the people of Ontario. You are for the developers and the Americans and this deal with Starlink and Elon Musk where you overpaid. How the hell are you going to protect us from Trump when his bestie is a guy you're doing business with? I mean, you guys keep making jokes about how passionate I am and how much I'm like a parliamentarian or whatever. The point is, I'm just articulating what I'm hearing all day long from people. And that's why shows like the one we're doing right now and the O show gets hundreds of thousands of views on our clips. Why? Because to your point, Gerard, people are engaged. There's an anti-incumbency movement around the world. There's a great fear of fascism rising by the day in this country. And we are looking at politicians with a great deal of concern and cynicism and skepticism. And people are saying, you know what? All I know is my life is getting worse. It seems like the rich are getting richer. And I don't think that narrative plays well for Doug Ford after the Greenbelt scandal and everything else. So if he can make the argument that, no, really, he's going to get it right this time, folks, then maybe people will buy into it. But I think a lot of people are looking for a place to park their vote to let Ford know they're displeased. And that will probably be the Liberals. Well,
and it may be, I'm not going to discount anything out that you said. Okay. We'll come back to this a couple of weeks from now. But I think we're going to have to see whether or not Bonnie Crombie and Merritt Stiles exceed expectations. That's really what this is about. I mean, people, when you vote, you and I know this. When you vote, you want to have confidence that that vote is going to go somewhere and do something that you want done on your behalf. And if you don't have that confidence, you're more likely to sit at home. Honestly, you are. It's kind of like, all right, so the question then becomes, how many will sit on their hands and not go out? How much will the opposition split the vote and therefore yield the center ground to Doug Ford? So, I don't know how Bonnie Crombie is going to, be in an election campaign. We've waited a long time for this. Yeah. Let's see how she does in the first 2 weeks. Gotta say, I would have done a better slogan, but if you got it, use it, and let's find out how you drive that thing.
And better
dare I say, before having a slogan, it would have been nice if we knew what seat she was running for. I'm just saying. That to me is
surprise, Mississauga.
Okay, but by now, John, that should have been done, sewn up, already done, in the bag, moving forward.
Yeah. You know what?
Yeah, I mean, Go ahead. I don't speak for the Liberal Party at all. I just know a little bit about the dynamics of things, and they are pulling, like, it's very interesting because the resting assumptions from Laura and from John both, you're kind of saying, well, hey, the Liberal Party, what the heck are they doing? Liberal Party barely existed for the last 4 years or 3 years.
Yeah.
It could have been 4, but it's only going to be 3 in terms of what happened since the last election. And unfortunately, there's a kind of a threshold where things become very difficult. It's not an excuse. The people are only going to gravitate towards something. There has to be something there. Absolutely take John's point, and Laura, I think those things that you're saying are going to be just aspirational, that people are going to figure out on their own. Mr. Ford is counting on people just being discouraged, and he's counting on those big events going on to take away the news and not leave space for all that reckoning. He's had 6 years. He got a mulligan because of the pandemic in progress. That's not going to be the case this time. This would be his reckoning election if there weren't these other things roiling in the background. And the question, I guess, is going to see is, does the public have a radar for that? It's not just the opposition. And again, I want to throw it up there. The public kind of does know things, and they're kind of waiting, and they look at those of us that have been political folks and they say, do I want to see that person for much longer? Am I getting tired of them? Or is there something that they said is a clunker? And Mr. Ford has had his clunkers in the past, but then he quickly has just sort of done this. I don't know if he took gymnastics when he was a kid, but he does these double backflips, and he's cleared the bar a number of times. Now, I don't know that is going to be as possible because of the amount of focus that there is. The opposition doesn't have to work as hard. They don't have to have many resources. They're actually going to have an election, a campaign. And, if people can come to the party, I think it can be much more open than I think we're kind of believing at this point.
Can I make a distinction between party and party brand? Yes, the Liberal Party, in terms of all its mechanics and everything else, was damaged. But in Ontario, we know there's 4 parties, right? 2 which are probably going to govern, and then the other 2 which do good work. And so I don't think that the Liberal brand in particular has gone too far out of the picture. I think people who were looking to vote for someone other than Ford in the past looked at Del Duca and go, Horvath, not going to happen. Now Bonnie represents a possibility. And so I think that it's not so much about whether or not the Liberal Party has been robust for the last 5 years. I think it's about whether or not people want to park their vote in protest to Ford. And that's why I said from the beginning, he wants this to be anti-Trump. The opposition should make it anti-Ford because that'll fire people up. Do they have to have something to vote for? Yes, they need to vote for doctors and they need to vote for housing. And they need to put that on the table and say, we're going to prioritize you and not prioritize the billionaire developers. We're not going to prioritize the wealthy over you. We're going to prioritize you, the people of Ontario. It's not a hard argument to make. They have been terrible so far at making it. I don't have a ton of hope that they're suddenly going to learn how to do this overnight. But I will throw in this, which we haven't discussed yet, which is kind of funny because we are an example of it as we sit here this afternoon. There are all kinds of other people in the political conversation that were not around the last time. There are tons of podcasts. There are tons of explosion in new media as our corporate media legacy media has shrunk, and we're all seeing that. No offense to their work, but they've shrunk. We are seeing a lot of robust conversation in places it didn't exist. So there are accounts on, I'll take X, for instance. My account on X and another 20 can get more coverage of a Bonnie Crombie statement or a Merritt Stiles statement or a Mike Schreiner statement than they can. Right? So I don't think this is just on the candidate and just on the formal campaign. This is on the conversation as a province. And there are a lot of very loud voices on all sides that are involved in the conversation. And so I just don't want to negate that. I think it's a bit of a...
No, but I don't think it's not going to be a default that wins, though. I think you still, there is something to what John is saying. I don't know that it's going to be about their brand and how clever they are. I think they can get by with maybe less. Because they've had this sprung on them, I think people will make some allowance and kind of thing. But they are going to want a government. They are going to want a government that can govern, pass the brand. Sorry.
Isn't it about organization, though? I mean, boots on the ground matter.
Yes.
And what I'm hearing right now is that in the Liberal Party, the brand may be what the brand is, and it's going to live on well beyond, anything we might outlive. But the point being, trying to attract the talent who can actually manage a campaign locally and actually get the people out knocking on doors and all of that kind of stuff. That's where the Liberal Party has bruised badly over the last 4 or 5
Well, it's not like it wasn't. They've done it a few times in this century, and it's not. Those people are all mainly living And so I do think this. I do think that people are game for a correction on the political front too. If they become convinced they're being taken advantage of here by Mr. Ford, you could see a bunch of people activated. That's the bear that could get poked here, because I think the one thing that the existential business that Mr. Trump is throwing at us does is it bugs people. And when people are bothered, they do something about it. And so I could see, trying to harness some of that. Mr. Ford may not like the fact that he's the first electoral chance for people to do stuff. It doesn't take 1 out of 5 people to go knocking on doors. It just takes a mobilized group of folks. And those people are out there. They're disposed. They're doing other things. They're helping on homelessness. They're cleaning up after Mr. Ford right now at the food banks. They're doing other things, but they're not that far away from knowing better and wanting to do something about it. So, that I don't think is the result, even though all the people with the big brass on them and the headquarters think it's all them. Some of this is a zeitgeist, and some of that zeitgeist, I think, is in favor of something happening, even in this very compressed time that we've got, which is
Let me make my final point. 2 of them. One of them, Laura, you're absolutely right. This afternoon was a milestone because the Trump White House press room, in fact, asked all podcasters and other types of non-legacy media to file in and to file for a seat there, and Axios asked the first question. So there you go. Yeah. 2, I agree with you, Gerard. There's the possibility of lightning in a bottle, but you have to take the cork off. And in order to do that, you got to have skill and boots on the ground to do it. And the NDP have been notorious in the last provincial and federal campaigns, particularly federal, where they ran a great air campaign, but they had no boots on the ground. And this is also a case of where, you may have a lot of people who you say should be coming together. They may come together in mindset, but they got to be at the front door to deliver the pamphlets and knock on the door and say, we got to get you out into the voting booth. Again, a matter of organization, I think the Conservatives go into the campaign stronger with, but I'd like to come back 2 weeks from now and see where we're at in the midpoint of this campaign to see whether or not those people who we all think might catch fire are either on fire and doing something, or sitting having a hot toddy and because it's too cold outside.
Just very quickly, arrogance is a funny thing, and I'm in a conservative provincial riding with Mr. Ford's nephew, who we haven't seen at all for a few years, and who isn't presenting himself again. Right. But there was no literature. There was no organization. It was all air war in terms of that. And frankly, there might be a bit of presumption going on out there on the things that, yes, you're talking about. They're astute. They're certainly to the point. But I do think, again, what I'm saying is that, again, we all think that we're the catalyst. If we got to do these things or people won't show up, it's not going to just be lightning. And yes, people have got to set the table. That's a well-known thing. Bonnie Crombie's running a lot of campaigns. There's a lot of folks that she has already, and I think that are there. And if the right things can fall in place, not all of them, even a few of them, she might get a lot more.
All right, so as we record this, we're 8 minutes into the dissolution of the legislature. So there's going to be lots of opportunity to continue. Laura will be back. John will be back. Gerard will be back. This was a spirited and great way to kick off the daily edition of On the Ledge. So thanks, Laura. It's good to have you. John, as always, and Gerard Kennedy. So just a reminder, we are going daily from now on as the WRIT period progresses. And we'll be live on YouTube. And then again, we'll be in your platforms wherever you listen to your podcasts, on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, etc. If you've got a thought on much of what was said in this last hour or so, go to my website, davetrafford.com. We've got the talkback message there. Just click the button. You've got 90 seconds. Leave us a message. And chances are pretty good that we'll incorporate what you have to say into the program. So it's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Thanks for sitting in on the first daily edition right here from Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.